Hey, it's Maria from Still Dreaming Homestead. Really good to be back with you again. We're going to be continuing to read in our book, Little House in the Big Woods by Laura Ingalls Wilder. We're on chapter 8 already. Dance at Grandpa's. Remember, they're very excited, especially Ma. She's going to wear her fancy delaine dress that she has never worn the whole time that Laura can remember. Monday morning, everyone got up in a hurry to get started to Grandpa's. Pa wanted to be there to help with the work of gathering and boiling the sap. Ma would help Grandma and the aunts make good things to eat for all the people who were coming to the dance. Now I'll show you this little picture. They dressed a lot different. Breakfast was eaten and the dishes washed and the beds made by lamplight. Pa packed his fiddle carefully in its box and put it in the big sled that was already waiting at the gate. The air was cold and frosty and the light was gray when Laura and Mary and Ma with baby Carrie were tucked in snug and warm under the robes on the straw on the bottom of the sled. That straw would help keep the cold from the bottom coming in. The horses shook their heads and pranced, making the sleigh bells dance and ring merrily, and away they went through the road, through the big woods, to Grandpa's house. The snow was damp and smooth in the road, so the sled slipped quickly over it. The big trees seemed to be hurrying by on either side. After a while, there was sunshine in the woods, and the air sparkled. The long streaks of yellow light lay between the shadows of the tree trunks, and the snow was colored faintly pink. All the shadows were thin and blue, and every little curve of snowdrifts and every track in the snow had a shadow. Pa showed Laura the tracks of the wild creatures in the snow at the side of the road. The small leaping tracks of cottontail rabbits, the tiny tracks of field mice, and the feather stitching tracks of the snowbirds. There were larger tracks like dog tracks, where foxes had run, and there were tracks of deer that had bounded away into the woods. The air was growing warmer already, and Pa said the snow wouldn't last long. It did not seem long until they were sweeping into the clearing at Grandpa's house, all the sleigh bells jingling. Grandma came to the door and stood there smiling and calling to them, "Come in, come in." She said that Grandpa and Uncle George were already at work out in the maple woods, so Pa went to help them, while Laura and Mary and Ma, with baby Carrie in her arms, went into Grandma's house and took off their wraps. We would call them coats now, but sometimes they were big pieces of material that they wrapped around them. Laura loved Grandma's house. It was much larger than their house at home. There was one great room, and there was a little room that belonged to Uncle George, and there was another room for the aunts, Aunt Dorca and Aunt Ruby, and there was a kitchen with a big cook stove. It was fun to run the whole length of the big room, from the large fireplace at one end all the way to Grandma's bed under the window at the other end. The floor was made of wide, thick slabs that Grandpa had hewn from the logs with his axe. That's how he'd cut them. The floor was smoothed over and scrubbed clean and white, and the big bed under the window was soft with feathers. The day seemed very short while Laura and Mary played in the big room and Ma helped Grandma and the aunts in the kitchen. The men had taken their dinner to the maple woods, so for dinner they did not set the table, but they ate cold venison sandwiches, that's deer meat, and drank milk. But for supper, Grandma made hasty pudding. Hasty means made quickly. She stood by the stove, stirring the yellow cornmeal from her fingers into the kettle of boiling salted water. She stirred the water all the time with a big wooden spoon and sifted in the meal until the kettle was full of thick, bubbling mass. Then she set it on the back of the stove where it would cook slowly. It smelled good. The whole house smelled good. With the sweet and spicy smells from the kitchen, the smell of the hickory logs burning with clear, bright flames in the fireplace, and the smell of the clove apple beside Grandma's mending basket on the table. The sunshine came through the sparkling window panes, and everything was large and spacious and clean. At supper, Pa and Grandpa came from the woods. Each had on his shoulders a wooden yoke that Grandpa had made. It was cut to fit around their necks in the back and hollowed out to fit over their shoulders. From each end hung a chain with a hook, and on each hook a big wooden bucket full of hot maple syrup. I'm going to show you what that looks like. Pa and Grandpa brought the syrup from the big kettle in the woods. They steadied the buckets with their hands, but the weight hung from the yokes on their shoulders. Grandma made room for a big brass kettle on the stove. Pa and Grandpa poured the syrup into the brass kettle. It was so large that it held all the syrup from 4 big buckets. Then Uncle George came with a smaller bucket of syrup, and everyone ate the hot, hasty pudding with maple syrup for supper. Now we would call that corn mush. Uncle George was home from the army. He wore his blue army coat with the brass buttons, and he had bold, merry blue eyes. He was big and broad, and he walked with a swagger. Laura looked at him all the time she was eating her hasty pudding because she had heard Pa say to Ma he was wild. George is wild since he came back from the war, Pa said, shaking his head as if he were sorry. But it couldn't be helped. Uncle George had run away to be a drummer boy in the army when he was only 14 years old. Laura had never seen a wild man before. She did not know whether to be afraid of Uncle George or not. When supper was over, Uncle George went outside and blew his army bugle. Long and loud, it made a lovely ringing sound far away through the big woods. The woods were dark and silent, and the trees stood as though they were listening. Then, from very far away, the sound came back, thin and clear and small, like a little bugle answering the big one. "Listen," Uncle George said. "Isn't that pretty?" Laura looked at him, but she did not say anything. And when Uncle George stopped blowing the bugle, she ran back into the house. Ma and Grandma cleared away the dishes and washed them and swept the hearth, while Aunt Dorca and Aunt Ruby made themselves pretty in their room. Laura sat on their bed and watched them comb out their long hair and part it carefully. They parted it from their foreheads to the naps of their necks. That's this part of your neck right here. And they parted it across ear to ear. They braided their back hair in long braids, and then they did the braids up carefully in big knots. They washed their hands and faces and scrubbed them well with soap in the wash basin on the bench in the kitchen. They used store soap, not the slimy, soft, dark brown soap that Grandma made and kept in a big jar for everyday common use. They fussed for a long time with their front hair, holding up the lamp and looking at their hair in the little looking glass, we call that a mirror, that hung on the log wall. They brushed it so it was smooth on each side of the straight white part, and it shone like silk in the lamplight. The little puff on each side shone too, and the ends were coiled and twisted neatly under the big knot in the back. Let's see. Can you see how they have it? See the knot in the back and how they're being so careful? Then they pulled on their beautiful white stockings that they had knit from fine cotton thread in lacy open-work patterns, and they buttoned up their best shoes. They helped each other with their corsets. Now, a corset is something they used to wear, and I'm really glad they don't wear it now. It would go around your middle of a woman, and it had strings, and they could pull those really tight and squeeze you in really tight so you look super skinny in the middle. But guess what? A little hard to breathe. So let's keep reading. They helped each other with their corsets. Aunt Dorcas pulled as hard as she could on Aunt Ruby's corset strings, and then Aunt Dorcas hung on to the foot of the bed while Aunt Ruby pulled on hers. "Pull, Ruby, pull," Aunt Dorcas said breathlessly. "Pull harder." So Aunt Ruby braced her feet and pulled harder. Aunt Dorcas kept measuring her waist with her hands, and at last she gasped, "I guess that's the best you can do." She said, "Carolyn says Charles could span her waist with his hands when they were married." Reach around her with his hands. Wow, that's pretty skinny in the waist. Carolyn was Laura's ma, and when she heard this, Laura felt proud. Then Aunt Ruby and Aunt Dorcas put on their flannel petticoats and their plain petticoats and their stiff starched white petticoats. That's kind of like shorts. And knitted lace all around the edges, and they put on their beautiful dresses. Aunt Dorcas' dress was a sprigged print, dark blue with sprigs of red flowers and green leaves thick upon it. The basque, or the waist, was buttoned down the front, that'd be the top half, buttoned down the front with black buttons which looked so exactly like big, juicy blackberries, Laura wanted to taste one. Aunt Ruby's dress was wine-colored calico, covered all over with a feathery pattern of lighter wine color. It buttoned with gold-colored buttons, and every button had a little castle and a tree carved on it. Aunt Dorcas' pretty white collar was fastened in front with a large round cameo pin, which had a lady's head on it. So a pin would be something to hold things closed. But Aunt Ruby pinned her collar with a red rose made of sealing wax. She had made it herself on the head of a darning needle, which had a broken eye, so it couldn't be used for sewing anymore. They looked lovely, sailing over the floor so smoothly with their large round skirts. Their little waists rose up tight and slender in the middle, and their cheeks were red and their eyes bright under the wings of shining, sleek hair. Ma was beautiful too, in her dark green delaine, with the little leaves that looked like strawberries scattered over it. The skirt was ruffled and flounced and draped and trimmed with knots of dark green ribbon, and nesting at her throat was a golden pin. The pin was flat, as long as wide as Laura's 2 fingers, and it curved all over and scalloped at the edges. The scallop goes up and down. Ma looked so rich and fine that Laura was even afraid to touch her. People had begun to come. They were coming on foot from the snowy woods with their lanterns, and they were driving to the door in sleds and wagons. Sleigh bells were jingling all the time. The big room filled with tall boots and swishing skirts, and ever so many babies lying in rows on Grandma's bed. Uncle James and Aunt Libby had come with their little girl, whose name was Laura Ingalls too. The two Lauras leaned on the bed and looked at the babies, and the other Laura said that her baby was prettier than baby Carrie. She is not either, Laura said. Carrie's the prettiest baby in the whole world. No, she isn't, said the other Laura. Yes, she is. And can you see what they look like? All those babies on the bed, and the two Lauras are arguing. They love their babies. Ma came sailing over in her fine Delane and said severely, Laura! So neither Laura said anything anymore. Uncle George was blowing his bugle. It was making a loud ringing sound in the big room, and Uncle George joked and laughed and danced, blowing the bugle. There he is, blowing his bugle. Then Pa took his fiddle out of the box and began to play. And all the couples stood in squares on the floor and began to dance when Pa called in the figures. Grand right and left, Pa called out, and all the skirts began to swirl and all the boots began to stomp. The circles went round and round, and the skirts were going one way and all the boots were going the other way, the hands clasping and pulling apart in the air. Swing your partners, Pa called, and each gent, that's a guy, bowed to the lady at your left. They all did as Pa said. Pa watched Ma's skirt swayed and her little waist bending and her dark hair head bowing, and she thought, Laura watched, and she thought Ma was the loveliest dancer in the whole world. The fiddle was singing, oh, you Buffalo girls, aren't you coming out tonight? Aren't you coming out tonight? Oh, you Buffalo girls, aren't you coming out tonight? Dance by the light of the moon. I don't know how that song really goes. The little circles and the big circles went round and round, and the skirts swirled and the boots stomped, and partners bowed, and they separated, and then they met again, and they bowed again. So this was a square dance. In the kitchen, Grandma was all by herself, stirring the boiling syrup in the big brass kettle. She stirred in time to the music. By the back door was a pail of clean snow, and sometimes Grandma took a spoonful of syrup from the kettle and poured it on some of the snow in the saucer. Laura watched the dancers again. Pa was playing the Irish washerwoman now. He called, do-si ladies, do-si-do, come on, come down heavy on your heel and your toe. Laura could not keep her feet still. Uncle George looked at her and laughed. Then he caught her by the hand and did a little dance with her in the corner. She liked Uncle George. Everybody was laughing over by the kitchen door. They were dragging Grandma in from the kitchen. Grandma was dressed beautiful, too. A dark blue calico with autumn-colored leaves scattered over it. Her cheeks were pink from laughing, and she was shaking her head. The wooden spoon was still in her hand. I can't leave the syrup, she said. But Pa began to play the Arkansas Traveler, and everybody began to clap their hands in time to the music. So Ma bowed to them all, and here's kind of what they look like. Can you see Laura dancing with her Uncle George? And she did a few steps herself, Grandma did. She could dance as pretty as any of them. The clapping almost drowned out the sound of Pa's fiddle. Suddenly, Uncle George did a pigeon wing, and bowing low before Grandma, he began to jig. Grandma tossed the spoon to somebody. She put her hands on her hips and faced Uncle George, and everybody shouted. Grandma was jigging. Laura clapped her hands in time to the music with all the other clapping hands. The fiddle sang as it had never sung before. Grandma's eyes were snapping and her cheeks were red, and underneath her skirts her heels were clicking as fast as the thumping of Uncle George's boots. Everyone was excited. Uncle George kept jigging, and Grandma kept facing him, jigging too. The fiddle did not stop until Uncle George began to breathe loudly, and he wiped the sweat from his forehead. Grandma's eyes twinkled. "You can't beat her, George," someone shouted. Uncle George jigged faster. He jigged twice as fast as he had been jigging. So did Grandma. Everybody cheered again. All the women were laughing and clapping their hands, and the men were teasing George. George did not care, but he did not have enough breath left to laugh. He was jigging. Pa's blue eyes were snapping and sparkling. He was standing up watching George and Grandma, and the bow danced over the fiddle strings. Laura jumped up and down and squealed, and she clapped her hands. Grandma kept jigging. Her hands were on her hips, and her chin was up, and she was smiling. George kept on jigging, but his boots did not thump as loudly as they had thumped at first. Grandma's heels kept clickety-clacking gaily. A drop of sweat dripped off George's forehead and shone on his cheek. All at once he threw up both arms and gasped, "I'm beat!" He stopped jigging. Everybody made a terrific noise, shouting and yelling and stamping, cheering Grandma. Grandma jigged just a minute more, then she stopped. She laughed and gasped. Her eyes sparkled just like Pa's when he laughed. George was laughing too and wiping his forehead with his sleeve. Suddenly, Grandma stopped laughing. She turned and ran as fast as she could in the kitchen. The fiddle stopped playing. All the women were talking at once, and all the men were teasing George. But everyone was still for a minute. When Grandma looked like that, then she came to the door between the kitchen and the big room and said, "The syrup is waxing. Come help yourselves." Then everybody began to talk and laugh again. They all hurried to the kitchen for plates, and outdoors to fill the plates with snow. The kitchen door was open and the cold air came in. Outdoors, the stars were frosty in the sky, and the air nipped Laura's cheeks and nose. Her breath was like smoke. She and the other Laura and all the other children scooped up clean snow with their plates. Then they went back to the crowded kitchen. Grandma stood by the brass kettle, and with a big wooden spoon she poured hot syrup on each plate of snow. It cooled into soft candy, and as fast as it cooled, they ate it. They could eat all they wanted, for maple sugar never hurt anybody. There was plenty of syrup in the kettle and plenty of snow outdoors. As soon as they ate one plateful, they filled their plates with more snow again, and Grandma poured more snow on it. When they had eaten the soft maple candy until they could eat no more of it, then they helped themselves to the long table loaded with pumpkin pies, and dried berry pies, and cookies and cakes. There was salt rising bread too, and cold boiled pork, and pickles. Oh, how sour those pickles were! They all ate till they could hold no more, and then they began to dance again. But Grandma watched the syrup in the kettle. Many times she took a little bit of it out into a saucer and stirred it round and round. And she shook her head and poured the syrup back into the kettle. The other room was loud and merry with the music of the fiddle and the noise of the dancing. At last Grandma stirred. The syrup in the saucer turned into little grains like sand. And Grandma called, "Quick, girls, it's graining." Aunt Ruby and Aunt Dorca and Ma left the dance and came running. They set out pans, big pans and little pans. As fast as Grandma could fill them with syrup, they set out more. They set the filled ones away to cool into maple sugar. Then Grandma said, "Now bring the patty pans for the children." There was a patty pan, or at least a broken cup or saucer, for every little girl and boy. They all watched anxiously while Grandma, boy, that was a big feast they were having, huh? While Grandma ladled out the syrup. Perhaps there would not be enough, then somebody would have to be unselfish and polite. There was just enough syrup to go around. The last scraping from the brass kettle exactly filled the very last patty pan. Nobody was left out. So a patty pan would be a children's pan, I suppose small. The fiddling and the dancing went on and on. Laura and the other Laura stood around and watched the dancers. Then they sat down on the floor in the corner and they watched. The dancing was so pretty, the music so gay and happy, that Laura knew she would never get tired of it. All the beautiful skirts went swirling by, the boots went stamping, and the fiddle kept on singing gaily. Then Laura woke up, and she was lying across the foot of Grandma's bed. It was morning. Ma and Grandma and baby Carrie were in the bed. Pa and Grandpa were sleeping, rolled up in blankets on the floor by the fireplace. Mary was nowhere in sight. She was sleeping with Aunt Dorca and Aunt Ruby in their bed. Soon everybody was getting up. There were pancakes and maple syrup for breakfast. And then Pa brought the horses and shed to the door. He helped Ma and Carrie get in, while Grandpa picked up Mary and Uncle George picked up Laura and tossed them over the edge of the sled into the straw. Pa tucked in the robes around them, and Grandpa and Grandma and Uncle George stood calling, "Goodbye, goodbye," as they rode away into the big woods, going home. The sun was warm, and the trotting horses threw up bits of muddy snow with their hooves. Behind the sled, Laura could see their footprints, and every footprint had gone through the thin snow into the mud. Before night, Pa said, "We'll see the last of the sugar snow." Well, that sounded like a really fun time. I've been to a dance before, and it was fun. But there weren't all ages like this one, and I think that's really nice. Well, it's Maria from Still Dreaming Homestead. I love you, I really do. But even more importantly, God loves you, and He always will. So, good night and keep dreaming. Bye-bye.